All right, diving in today, and we got a thinker who's, well, he sparked a lot of debate, that's for sure. Carl Schmitt.
Yeah, definitely a figure who you can't really ignore, even if you strongly disagree with some of his, well, a lot of his conclusions. German conservative political and legal theorist, 1888 to 1985.
Right, and for our listeners who are, into getting to the core of these complex ideas quickly, I think Schmitt is someone who you can get a lot out of, even if it's just to sharpen your own thinking by, really wrestling with his arguments.
Absolutely. He forces you to confront some really fundamental questions about how political order works or, maybe how it doesn't work, depending on your perspective.
Yeah, and we have to address the elephant in the room right away. Schmitt's support for and involvement with the Nazi regime. It's a dark stain on his legacy, and it's something we can't just brush aside.
No, absolutely not. But the fact that his ideas still generate so much discussion and debate, even with that baggage, I think tells us something about their enduring power, to provoke.
Yeah, to make you think. So our deep dive today is to try to unpack some of those ideas, particularly for, our listeners who approach these topics with a philosophical mindset. We're going to look at his concept of sovereignty, his very particular definition of the political, and his pretty scathing critique of liberalism.
And to do that, we'll be focusing on some of his most important works from the Weimar period. Political theology, where he really lays out his theory of sovereignty. The crisis of parliamentary democracy, which, as the title suggests, takes aim at, well, parliamentary democracy, and the concept of the political, which is maybe his most controversial work, where he really digs into the essence of what he sees as the political realm.
Right. So let's start with sovereignty. And, Schmitt, right off the bat in political theology, he makes this really bold statement. He says that any functioning legal order needs a sovereign authority.
Yeah, he doesn't beat around the bush. And it's a direct challenge to a lot of liberal thinking about law, right? The idea that you can have a system of just abstract rules and norms, and that everyone, including the state, is bound by those rules.
Right. The rule of law is the ultimate authority. But Schmitt says, hold on a second.
Exactly. He argues that in practice, you always need someone or some institution to have the final say to decide how those rules apply in specific situations, especially when there's disagreement or ambiguity.
So it's like, yeah, the law's all well and good in theory, but in the real world, things get messy.
Yeah, exactly. And he's very much echoing Hobbes here, right? The idea that it's not truth, it's authority that ultimately gives the law its force.
So for our listeners who are thinking, okay, but we have courts, we have judges, we have a whole system for interpreting and applying the law. What does Schmitt say to that?
He says those systems only work because they're operating within a certain context, what he calls a homogeneous medium. Basically, a shared understanding of basic norms and values. Without that underlying agreement, he says, the application of those abstract legal rules becomes much more difficult, much more prone to conflicting interpretations. And that's when things can break down, when you start to slide towards chaos.
So in a situation where there's just total societal breakdown, the normal legal procedures might become not just difficult, but totally irrelevant.
Exactly. And that's where the sovereign comes in. And here we get to his famous definition. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception.
So the sovereign is the one who gets to say, all right, the normal rules don't apply anymore. We're in a state of emergency, and I get to decide what happens now.
Right. It's the power to suspend the normal legal order in the face of an existential threat, to do whatever is necessary to restore, well, what the sovereign deems to be normalcy.
And for a lot of people, especially those coming from a more, liberal perspective, this is where the alarm bells really start going off.
Right.
Because if the sovereign's decision in this state of exception isn't bound by the law, what's to stop them from just doing whatever they want?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And it's a question that Schmitt himself kind of dances around. He acknowledges that there could be, some legal conditions, some limits on the declaration of a state of exception. But ultimately, he's very skeptical of those limits, of trying to codify exactly what the sovereign can and can't do in these extreme situations.
Because he says you can't predict what kind of crisis is going to happen, and you can't predict what kind of actions are going to be needed to deal with it.
Right. And it's not just about dealing with the immediate crisis, right? It's about what comes after. Because when the sovereign decides on the exception, when they decide what constitutes a threat and how to respond to it, they're also, in a way, shaping the political identity of the community. They're saying, this is what's normal, this is what we stand for, and this is what we will not tolerate.
Right. And that can be really dangerous. because it can lead to the exclusion, the persecution of anyone who the sovereign decides doesn't fit into that definition of normalcy.
Exactly. And this is where his analysis of dictatorship comes in. He distinguishes between what he calls classical dictatorship, like in ancient Rome, where it was a temporary measure to defend the existing constitution, and what he calls sovereign dictatorship, which is about creating a new constitution, a new order.
And he actually says that this sovereign dictatorship is a kind of a democratic institution.
Yeah, which is a real head scratcher, right?
Yeah.
But his argument is that even though the sovereign dictator might be acting outside the existing legal framework, they're doing it in the name of the people to establish a new and supposedly better democratic order.
Right. So it's like they're claiming to be expressing the will of the people, even if they're doing it in a way that, most people would probably find pretty undemocratic.
Exactly. And this gets to the heart of, one of the big philosophical problems with Schmitt's work, right? The tension between this need for a strong, decisive authority and the danger of that authority becoming tyrannical.
So let's move on to maybe his most famous and most unsettling idea, the friend-enemy distinction. He lays this out in the concept of the political, and it really cuts to the core of how he sees the political realm.
Yeah. He says, straight up, that the defining characteristic of the political is the distinction between friend and enemy.
And it's really important to understand what he means by that, because he's not talking about, personal disagreements or just having different opinions.
No, not at all. He's talking about a fundamental distinction between groups, a distinction that's based on the possibility of real existential conflict, even war. The friend is someone you're willing to fight alongside, to die for, and the enemy is someone you're willing to kill just because they belong to that other group.
So it's about that potential for violence, that willingness to use force, that defines the political for Schmitt.
Right. And he's very clear that this distinction isn't based on any particular set of values or beliefs or interests. It's not about being morally good or bad or having the right ideology. It's about that fundamental division between us and them, between those who belong to the political community and those who are outside of it, who represent a threat to its existence.
And he says that this friend-enemy dynamic is like a permanent feature of human existence.
Yeah.
Even if one conflict ends, another one will always emerge.
Right. Because for Schmitt, a group that doesn't have enemies, a group that isn't willing to defend itself, even through violence, it's not really a political community at all. It's just a collection of individuals.
So it's like the act of identifying an enemy is what actually creates a political community, what gives it a sense of identity and purpose.
Exactly. It's by defining who the enemy is, that you define who you are, who you're willing to fight for. And this, of course, has some pretty troubling implications, right? Because it suggests that political identity is inherently exclusionary, that is based on drawing a line between those who are in and those who are out.
Right. And Schmitt is very critical of liberalism because he sees it as trying to erase that line, to pretend that we can all just get along, that we can resolve all our differences through reason and compromise.
Yeah, he sees liberalism as this attempt to depoliticize the world, to replace real political decisions, decisions about friend and enemy, with, technical administration or ethical universalism.
And he thinks that's really dangerous, because it leaves us vulnerable both to internal factions that can exploit the system and to external enemies who are still operating in that friend-enemy logic.
Right. He argues that a state that can't distinguish between friend and enemy, a state that's afraid to use force, is a state that's ultimately going to fail to protect its citizens.
But it's not just about security, right? There's a deeper philosophical critique here. Schmitt seems to be saying that a world without the friend-enemy distinction would be a meaningless world.
Yeah. He thinks that this idea of a completely peaceful, harmonious world where everyone just gets along and focuses on their own individual happiness, it would be a very shallow existence. He thinks that the political, that struggle between friend and enemy, that willingness to sacrifice yourself for something bigger than yourself, that's what gives life meaning.
Of course, a lot of people would say, wait a minute, just because you're willing to kill for something doesn't make it meaningful. And maybe there are other ways to find meaning in life besides constantly being at war with someone.
Yeah, definitely. And Schmitt himself, he's not glorifying war. He's just saying that it's an inescapable reality, that it's part of what it means to be human, to live in a political community.
And some people would argue that his whole worldview is based on a pretty pessimistic view of human nature, that he sees us as inherently conflictual, inherently selfish.
Right. Some scholars have even suggested that there's a kind of a theological undercurrent to his thinking, like maybe he's influenced by the idea of original sin, that we're all born flawed, and we need a strong authority to keep us in check.
So for a philosopher who's trying to wrap their head around Schmitt, what are some of the big takeaways? What are the questions that his work forces us to confront?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is this idea of decisionism, the idea that ultimately political authority is based on a decision, not on some pre-existing law or principle. And that's a really challenging idea for a lot of, liberal philosophers who believe in the rule of law and the idea that power should be constrained by reason and by agreed upon procedures.
And his whole conception of the political as this realm of potential violence, of friend versus enemy, it really forces us to think about the dark side of politics, the way that it can be used to divide us, to create conflict, to justify violence.
And even if you completely reject his conclusions, even if you think his ideas are dangerous, he forces you to confront some really uncomfortable truths of how power works in the world and about the limits of, liberal ideals like reason and compromise.
And of course, we can't forget the historical context, the fact that Schmitt was a supporter of the Nazi regime. It makes it even more important to grapple with his ideas, to understand how they could be used to justify such horrific acts.
Absolutely. Because his work is still relevant today. People are still debating his ideas, still using them to justify different political positions. So it's not just a historical curiosity. It's something that we need to engage with critically, to understand the dangers, but also maybe to find some insights that might help us navigate the political challenges of our own time.
So to sum up our deep dive into Carl Schmitt, we've got a thinker who is deeply controversial, who is associated with one of the most evil regimes in history. But he also left behind a body of work that is incredibly thought-provoking, that challenges a lot of our assumptions about how politics and law work.
He gave us this concept of sovereignty as ultimately residing in the ability to decide on the exception, to step outside the normal legal order when necessary. He defined the political realm as being fundamentally structured by the distinction between friend and enemy. And he offered a really sharp critique of liberalism, arguing that it ultimately fails to grasp the true nature of political life.
So, as a final thought for our listeners to ponder, I think it's worth asking, even if we reject Schmitt's conclusions, can his framework, particularly this idea of the friend-enemy distinction, help us understand the rise of political polarization that we're seeing in so many parts of the world today?
Yeah.
This tendency to divide ourselves into these warring camps, these us versus them narratives.
And if Schmitt is right, if a functioning legal order really does require this figure of the sovereign who can decide on the exception, how do we prevent that power from being abused? What kind of safeguards do we need to put in place to make sure that sovereignty doesn't turn into tyranny?
So we encourage you, our listeners, to go and read Schmitt for yourselves, wrestle with his ideas, and as always, keep thinking deeply.